is my favorite time of year. It's easy to incorporate seasonal style in the living room with fun pillows.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the first in a little series that we're doing here at Saint-Esprit on church architecture. Over the last 2,000 years or so, we're going to be exploring the spirituality of why
Summer is my favorite time of year. It's easy to incorporate seasonal style in the living room with fun pillows.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the first in a little series that we're doing here at Saint-Esprit on church architecture. Over the last 2,000 years or so, we're going to be exploring the spirituality of why churches have been built in. Hello everybody, and welcome to the first.
Predator generators give you the power to do more for less. Only at Harbor Freight.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the first in a little series that we're doing here at Saint-Esprit on church architecture. Over the last 2,000 years or so, we're going to be exploring the spirituality of why churches have been built in certain ways. We're going to be exploring the theology and the art, the architecture behind those Christian buildings. But before we look at the development of the styles of Christian building. Hello everybody.
Down to the right where it says CC. That goes back to one. It's on the screen. Just about it's on the
Rain, make it, rain girl, make it.
You again. Everybody.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the first in a little series that we're doing.
Thank you. Good morning. How are you?
Nice to meet you. How you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good.
For this, but I'm meeting her. Halfway there and then we'll go. Yes. I will do it. That's just for observational stuff. Some of this, you know, when I was doing my fundraising, I think it's same thing. And they also, you know, to use that first day, I think they third, you know, yeah. She said that. And the land votes or. No. It was too. Upscaling. Okay. All right, sure. Good. You don't give up that out there. I mean, a lot of people. Seem like we're going. I think they got it. Yeah. No, it's just treatment of the way. Astronaut, the human bird, the church is. This is outside. Right. Take off the back. Now see. There's no lot of art with Texas. So the dates are the whole thing. There's solutions. Like this one. It's fully right. It is cold holidays there, but it's more holidays. Hopefully my cousin does. Good morning. We'll wait just a few minutes to see if they show up. Yeah. I don't know if Reverend Kathy's can create that. We'll wait just a few minutes. You told me to go back to.
That you want me to introduce.
Well, it's not his native officer. Here.
Oh, yeah. There's a breeze. Again.
That's true. But I
Got to talk fast like the weather girls.
All right. Good morning. So we're gonna go ahead and get started because we have a lot. to cover. Who knew that church architecture could be so exciting? It is so. When I first thought about this when this subject was presented, turns out it's really interesting, the things that we're going to cover.
Who are you? She asked if you can introduce yourself.
I'm about to, waiting for. Okay. I am Michael Marlin, and so I see you all here this morning. I'm a good reader when I have something to read, so I've written some notes here to keep me on track. Thank you for being here this morning as we begin this very interesting spiritual VA law of the church architect. Today we start the fascinating exploration of sacred spaces, those hallowed grounds where the earthly meets the divine, where the heart finds solace and where communities gather in shared purpose to worship and practice faith. I'd like to start by sharing a personal experience that ignited my deeper interest in this subject. Some of you who know me already knew what I'm going to say, I'm sure. In February of this year, my fiancée Cassandra and I had the incredible opportunity to vacation in Italy, where we visited countless cathedrals and basilicas. If any of you have ever been to Italy, you know Italy is mostly cathedrals and basilicas. One evening, we found ourselves in the enchanting St. Mark's Basilica in Venice.
No, it's coming. It's inside you.
Is it Holy Spirit? We were in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, and we were bathed in that soft glow of candlelight. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. See, it's just magical, really. And the intricate mosaic tiles shimmered softly on the golden ceilings, and depicting Bartlett telling the stories of the Bible. It's really something to see if you haven't. The air was filled with a reverence that felt almost palpable. It was as if time itself paused, allowing us to fully absorb the beauty and history surrounding us. The holy had stood there. Strange to think about this. We ended our journey in Rome, having flown into Venice to make our way to Italy. And in those last days of our trip, we crossed town very early in the morning, still dark, to Vatican City. Vatican City went to the Sistine Chapel, where I proposed to Cassandra. In front of the few people who were there with us on the drive too. They weren't expecting that. Michelangelo's extraordinary artwork, we've all probably seen it, at least in a book or a documentary or in person. The hand of God reaching toward Adam. The moment was one neither of us will ever forget. The atmosphere of that story chapel was truly extraordinary. Later that day, we stood in awe before the enormous grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica. The sheer scale is huge, and intricate details were breathtaking. There are statues there that look like they're about our size, but they're really like double our size. They're 10 to 12 feet tall, and just because of the way that they're featured on the walls and the ceiling, they look like they're our size. The dome, also designed by Michelangelo, seemed to stretch to infinity, inviting us to contemplate something greater than ourselves. These experiences reminded me of the profound impact that church architecture can have on our spiritual journey. That's what we're embarking upon today. Let's learn more about that. Today, we might imagine majestic temples of Greece and Rome, where the grand columns of Parthenon and Pantheon had stood as testaments to human aspiration and devotion. These architectural marvels were not merely buildings. They were designed to evoke a sense of the divine, drawing the eye upward to the heavens. In the video today, we will see examples of the early Christian period in which we'll encounter the emergence of basilicas. These, at the time, were really revolutionary spaces designed to welcome the community into a shared experience of worship. We'll see and hear about pointed arches and flying buttresses that weren't just functional. They were a bold expression of humanity's desire to reach higher, to touch the heavens. We will be brought into the modern era in which we witness a profound evolution in how sacred spaces are conceived. The minimalist designs in contemporary churches nowadays invite a sense of introspection and simplicity. So why does this journey through sacred spaces matter? I believe church architecture is not merely about bricks and mortar, it's about the stories we tell, the connections we forge, and the communities we build. Each sacred space is a reflection of the values and aspirations of its time, a mirror that shows us who we are and who we aspire to be. So as we dive deeper into this topic, I invite you to consider, what does sacred space mean to you? How do these architectural wonders influence our understanding of faith, community, and the transcendent? So let's unravel these questions together as we explore the fascinating nexus of faith, art, and architecture in sacred spaces throughout history. I'm going to start the video, and after about 9 minutes, I'm going to stop it and we're going to skip over some stuff because we just don't have enough time to cover this 35-minute video today. So there will be a little bit of a break. And if you can't hear, please let me know, because this guy's voice is very soft. If you have trouble with a British accent, sorry.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the first in a little series that we're doing here at Saint-Esprit on church architecture over the last 2,000 years or so.
On the video. Are you actually put it up?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
We're going to be exploring the spirituality of why churches have been built in certain ways. We're going to be exploring the theology and the art, the architecture behind those Christian buildings. But before we look at the development of the styles of Christian buildings through the last 2,000 years or so, we're going to start by asking some pretty general questions about the topic. And first of all, we'll start with some reservations or criticisms that people have had about why we build churches at all. First of all, if God made the universe, isn't everywhere holy? Some people say that they worship God better in nature than they do in a building, actually. But why do we think of certain spaces as more holy than others? On the left, we have Central Park in New York, and on the right, we have the high altar of the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome. So the question is God more at home in one place than in another? Where would you fancy worshipping God more? On the left-hand side, perhaps you could worship God alone, but on the right-hand side, certainly you would be worshipping God together with other people, which is what church or ecclesia is all about. Also, Jesus said that the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So why are we making these elaborate and expensive buildings? Surely there are more poor people in the world and victims of war and oppression that could be better served by using the resources that went into the building of churches to relieve their needs. Perhaps by the end of the course, we'll be able to try and answer that very, very difficult question. Thirdly, would we be able to learn about our faith if it wasn't for buildings? Do church buildings teach us something about God that can't actually be learned in any other way? Here you have the west portal of Chartres Cathedral, which is a sermon in stone, and we'll be discovering why when we look at Gothic architecture. So I hope that as we look at the development of church architecture, we're going to be able to answer some of these questions, but I bet we'll have many, many more questions that we want to ask. Firstly, our surroundings have got a profound effect on what we experience. As you can see on the left-hand side, if you walked into that particular space, you would have very, very different feelings than if you walked into the space that you can see on the right. A nice time in store on the right and a potentially unpleasant time in store on the left. So the most basic definition of a sacred space is a place where we feel that our environment, our surroundings, are naturally or consciously actually created in order to put us in the presence of something that's greater than ourselves. Now, this experience of sacred space is common to all human civilizations, and high places in particular have been associated with the home of the gods, and so have caves in the deep places of the earth. So mountains and caves have been endowed with spiritual significance, and people have sought them out as places of religious importance. And in places where there were no mountains, for instance, people constructed high places, built them up. Think here of the Tower of Babel as an example. On the right-hand side, we can see a church in France that's been built on the top of a volcanic plug, a high place that came naturally. Here we can see the ziggurat of Ur, which was constructed around 2100 BC. It was originally a lot higher than this. The base of it here has been reconstructed, but it had various other levels built on top of it in the flat plains of Mesopotamia, with the Holy of Holies, the temple, on the very top of it. Here's a cave, which is often the source of fertilizing rivers, in fact. In the ancient world, they were sometimes thought to be thought of as the mouths of hell, or here, in this case, in a place like Delphi, in the Corcyraean cave, a cave from which the oracle spoke on the top of Mount Parnassus. Something similar here at Lourdes is happening. Here we have the sacred cave in which the Blessed Virgin Mary made an appearance to those three children. But it's not just mountains and caves that are sacred and holy to people. Springs of water, groves of trees, or a strangely shaped stone, or a particular unusual feature of the landscape would lead people to think of it as a particularly holy place. On the bottom left here, we have Jacob's pillow, the place where Jacob dreamt of the ladder between earth and heaven, waking up saying, surely God was in this place and I didn't know it. People still leave stones there, as you can see on the top of Jacob's pillow. And on the right-hand side, we can see Takebostan in Iran, where a particularly sacred mountain has been carved out into sacred temples here, as you can see. Here's a famous example of it, El Qurn in the Valley of the Kings in Luxor. We're all familiar with the pyramids in the northern part of Egypt, but here in the southern part of Egypt, near Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, we have a naturally pyramid-shaped mountain, which is exactly why this natural feature of the landscape, which looks like a pyramid, was used to carve out the tombs of the kings of the New Kingdom in Egypt. Now, some people call these spaces thin places where people have sensed that another world is breaking through. Perhaps people have had dreams there, as we just saw in Jacob's Pillow, or something very significant has happened to a saint in that place, a martyrdom or a miracle. And very often, people will say that when they enter a specifically religious place, they sense the presence of God or even the power of God. Here you can see in Syracuse Cathedral that a sacred space in Syracuse that was used by the Greeks when Sicily was part of the Greek world, they've reused the pillars that were used in the pagan temple in a new temple on the same spot. And here we can see successive uses of the same sacred space once again in Luxor in southern Egypt, where, as you can see on the right-hand side, we have the pylons of the temple dedicated to Amun-Ra by the ancient Egyptians. The same spot was used by the Copts for a Christian church, and now it's the site of a mosque, as we can see here, a sacred space for Islam. Here's another cave for us in Monte Sant'Angelo. The Archangel Michael appeared there to the Bishop of Sipontum. Now, very often people will say that when they enter a space, they sense the presence of God and the power of God, as I've mentioned. But there are actually three types of power in a space that's been set aside for worship. We're going to explore them very briefly. Divine power. What is God doing in that place? How do we feel the presence of God in that place? Secondly, there's social power being exercised in that place, power that's related to a variety of hierarchies, both social hierarchies and ordained clerical hierarchies. This is the power that we experience exercised in a place by the power or authority of a priest, a minister, a preacher, or important members of a congregation, as we'll see in a moment. Thirdly, there's a sort of personal power that comes from walking into a sacred space, the feelings that you would get of spiritual empowerment that an individual might find on encountering the divine in a religious building through pilgrimage, through worship, through popping into a church to say a private prayer, for instance, and coming out feeling more calm or more empowered by your encounter in that spiritual space. Just now, perhaps we'll explore them later on. Here we can see that the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is the national shrine of Mexico, was actually built very near a sacred site that was already sacred to the Aztecs' mother goddess, Tonantzin, Our Lady of Guadalupe. And here is a famous picture of her that's instantly recognizable. Next, we move on to classical culture. This begins about 3000 BC, a little bit later, perhaps 2500 BC. People were moving away from these strictly tribal or chiefdom societies to larger groups of people who were organized into states, and as we see later on, into empires. And at this period, monotheism began to replace polytheism. So God's transcendence was emphasized more than God's immanence in nature. And that had an impact on the way sacred space was envisioned. Here you can see St. Paul's outside the walls. And you can see that in this case, this is not a space that has been arranged in a circular fashion. It's been arranged in a very linear fashion. This period writing was invented, and it enabled the birth of religions with a holy book. It also meant that teachings could be standardized over very large areas. So religious architecture was standardized over very large areas. This is an example of it. And leadership isn't any longer in the hands of these nature-rooted shamans, but in the hands of these temple-based priests. This is a Christian example of it, but Christians took over these sacred sites of the religions that preceded them and adapted them to Christian use. So these churches were built to reflect this uniform worship of God and the power of the priests to mediate it. Here we have the apse, the transept, the nave built for a procession, and an apse built for the enthronement of the person who was presiding over the religious ritual that was taking place in the space, as we can see here. Modern culture began around 1400 BC. These dates are very arbitrary, it has to be said, and in which this sort of sharp distinction between spirit and matter that we saw in classical culture began to be challenged by philosophers, and they emphasized a sort of return to this rootedness in the earth. It was also the time of the Protestant Reformation, as we'll see in a moment, and the Protestant Reformation tended to undermine those hierarchical structures that we saw in stone there in St. Paul's outside the walls. They challenged the authority of the Pope, of the priests, of the monks and the nuns to some extent, and put the power in the hands of individual human conscience. It was also the time of the scientific revolution, obviously, and the drive to figure out criteria to judge what was true, what was real or not. And this modern culture is characterized by a certain individualism, a fragmentation of society. It's no longer under one holy writ. It's now the province of specialists who are specialists in this or specialists in that or the other. And this resulted in modern culture in this loss of a holistic view of reality. And religion eventually became a private affair. And that's why we see in these churches this sort of thing developing. Individual box pews, a place where the reader sits. There's no longer a high altar that is the focus of this thing. It looks like a space that is more designed for individual worship, places where individual was prioritized over the general, over the mass. In postmodern culture, which we find emerging after the Second World War, we see a skepticism about everything. Deconstruction. Some postmodern thinkers, Derrida and these others, they try and deconstruct everything that's gone before to say that your perception as an individual of what is real is all that matters. You can interpret things how you wish. Others, after this fragmentation, after this desire to return to this holistic view that we saw earlier expressed in primal societies and to some extent in classical societies where there was a homogeneity, there's a sort of longing for that return, and that has meant that a sort of radical orthodoxy has developed, trying to return to the fundamentals of the Christian faith, a return to symbols and myths and rituals that bring us back in some ways to primal culture. It's also far more relational than we saw in that picture of modern culture. Postmodern culture tends to emphasize the fact that we relate to each other. We communicate with each other, unfortunately, far too often through electronic devices, especially during the pandemic, as we saw, but that was something of a gift to us during that period. But postmodern culture has tried to have a return to this idea that we're all in it together. And therefore, that's going to affect the way in which the church architecture is being built in this postmodern era. And to conclude, here are just a couple of slides of that. Here we can see a church in the round, a very modern church. You may like it, you may dislike it, but here you can see it's not individual box pews. We still have an altar up here, but there's no altar rail around it. Clearly it's a sacred space. It's elevated very slightly here in relationship to the bottom pews, but there's no altar rail that seems to be separating it off. We see the holy flowing out and flowing in as well at the same time, post-Vatican II church. And here's an example of a modern Roman Catholic church that shows us some of this longing to return to something that we call about orthodoxy, or the good old days of when churches looked like proper churches. And here you can see a high altar separated by a rail. We can see an apse. It seems to be a return in some ways to the picture that we saw earlier on of St. Paul's without the walls. Even from the outside, it looks like a modern construction, but it also looks very much like a revival of what Christian architecture used to look like. So our final point might be a little puzzle after we've looked at the ways in which societies have constructed these holy spaces through time. This is the puzzle. We're busy at the moment accommodating our lives to all of our contemporary conditions of postmodernism, technology, economics, sociology, and everything. But when we look at our churches, sometimes all we want is good old-fashioned classical religion, as we can see from these pictures. There's pictures here of this modern Roman Catholic church. We feel, some of us anyway, perhaps, that the church should always look the same. So how do we construct churches that affirm the goodness of creation that we saw in primal cultures, and the need for redemption in Christ, the sacredness of nature and the redemption of nature through Christ that Paul talks about? How do we make churches that show that God is present in creation, but also transcendent over all things? How do we build a church space that does recognize the distinct roles and the power positions in the church that we just explored, but also affirms the basic racial and sexual equality of all people, the equality between single people and married people, between young people and old people? How can we create a holy space that does that? So perhaps it's hardly surprising that there are so many different kinds of church in existence, and we're going to be looking at that in the next few sessions. So that's about it for now. In our next video, we're going to be exploring some of the vocabulary that is used to describe sacred spaces in Christianity: cathedral, basilica, temple, church, shrine. And we're going to do a little quiz on whether or not we can spot whether a church is a church or something else. Until then, I'm going to say cheerio for now, and hope you...
Cheerio. Isn't that nice? Okay, so you all now are experts in sacred spaces. And after this is over at about 9:50 or 9:55, you can see Father Anthony in the back. He'll be handing certificates. If he doesn't have babies.
I think she'll sign them.
So the next part of this is for us to.
You can join us for the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Cheerio. All right, so we have some discussion questions. So just in the table groups that you're in, or we can move around if you like to, please consider these questions. Why do we think of certain spaces as more holy than others? Where would you prefer to worship God? Share why if you'd like. What examples have you experienced about lessons to be learned from church buildings themselves? And what spiritual lessons have you learned from worshiping God in nature? Ready, set, go.
Why do we find the students that you're in? You got to like experience.
Inside. You know what, next day. And the church. You was blinded by how. Fully experienced. Sometimes. Yes. Perfect. How I felt. Upstairs, I mean, but it really was like, I was good in this, that I don't like this, like this. And I am. Not really, and things, and I don't forget, and felt like it's good, literally, good, right, to do it. Very comfortably hard, because I very nice. For sure, expect, sure, it's funny, it was fun, and then I have to be when I in the streets, a lot of contractors. So.
I think that's you and me is
Here, and I forget to call this. It was a fun. But it was. And I think how. Here.
So
Sometimes the altar is like. Altars up there.
But the things that only has to be. Yeah, like. Yeah, so when we walked into their church, they had the photo booths and.
It was like, yeah, it was a big stage.
Stage and I didn't feel. I didn't feel none of that stuff. Say, second, when I am here to like church, that deals that you see the visual. Yeah.
It seems like, when you look into it, could be, you know, it seems like a dedicated space.
Yes.
And walk in, there's no mistake. It's easier.
They want to come to space. It's a beautiful space. I'm not sure, you know,
The question was, why do we think in certain spaces it's being so familiar? What I think I can you to say is the invite feels a sense of spiritually.
So your daughter's supposed to do that. She goes to like a Bible church. So you know where we see visiting her. We go like. Yeah. We did some understanding. I know the second was actually. When I'm from South America and I'm the organizing, you know, at the time, I was in on yes. So every church you walk in, they love every same, very just like. Yeah. That's it, was not even part of it. And also, you know, I guess you don't, I have an attitude also. But when I. Years better. No, but. And I see that. Always everybody spiritual. So we are that shows you it's a fire night. Later. And I was ready. So we went with my friend actually invited me. And I will be sure. Yeah, I maybe be one. You share. Which is nice, and the attention has already. That is a lot to learn. Yes. And yes, there, these are the years. As the just have beds, people just, you know, they sort of so they have a certain extent, they're good job. So they are very. And then you know something that it's like, yeah, it's like they want you to be pastor. Yeah, and that's it, and they don't get it. I appreciate it now, but yeah. Right. It's more. There, it's like the handle and they reach out. So it was, you know, like, I have to say, you know, when she is. And to say how we would do that. Yeah, I think that it's like a situation, but having a pew where you sit with each other versus chairs, where you sit individually. And I think that's part of that.
I think we've answered where we all prefer.
Yeah.
Everyone can find what you got.
So I think also compromise as
We prefer to work in community and the environment that is really an atmosphere that devotes so spirituality.
I really have to do it, but it's very, the moment you have the candles, and it's in your church, there's no very serious, right? Like it's a whole. But it's serious, and because it has not. People, when they go to visit, it's interesting what's the differences between all of these churches, and they just feel what's meant to be felt, yeah, they walk in and go, this church, and really walk to see leaders, or any of those churches, feel that, like, it doesn't feel.
My first experience at a chance. I just say John Baptist, and I didn't know technically was not it's a very modern church for sure. Very. There was nothing about this when I said that is Central America. So it's nothing but fun. So it was the thing that you felt the spirituality, which is just the altar. The altar of the priest, but it's priest. And then I went to where we had a big facility.
Yeah.
And I was like, no. I felt so much. And it was amazing.
Physical space. And I guess it's because I'm saying history, I know.
What examples have you experienced about lessons and learning in church buildings that some you alluded to that?
Yeah.
Well, it's just not different.
What-
I mean, even that.
Yeah, just from church.
Give me that feeling during the story. Well, no, you just being in church, you are saying, well, you know, stuff happens. It makes sense. For them, not make it. Two questions. Reasonable, so that is important. You know, so we're going, you know, we're out right going. I read it here, I'm going on and I'm going to see very well. It was all research. Yeah. It's, yeah. It's gone. We don't have that. There's something he said for you. Have the second question there about how we can find the same about nature. I think it's secondarily into the actual version. It's you can always say. And I'll have to say it. The internet way. Right. And they did this. And their doctors are yeah. She's saying, right, we're going to be like there. Church and the sunset during the night. Very unlikely. I love.
What's the next question?
So they're asking the next question.